This is Mutual Exchange Radio, a project of the Center for Stateless Society. My name is Corey Massimino, and today I'm joined by Cathy Reisenwitz. Cathy's a writer and an OnlyFans creator with Bylines and TechCrunch, The Daily Beast, Reason, and other fine publications. Her newsletter is Sex and the State. Thanks for coming on, Cathy, and talking.
Thanks so much for having me, Corey. Great to see you again.
It's been a while since we've chatted. We've known each other for probably going on a decade now, because we used to be in similar organizations. So it's funny to think about how time flies.
Oh, I know it. Don't remind me how old I am.
We're back in the early 2010s for this conversation. So I wanted to start just by maybe giving our listeners a sense of, where you're coming from and your ideas and your worldview. So maybe you could share, I don't know, who some of your influences are. Who do you read? Who's played a part in shaping the way you think about things?
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up conservative, evangelical in Alabama, and got into libertarianism when I was in college, as many do, and got into how to market libertarian ideas and realized that they weren't really getting a lot of purchase among people who weren't cis, het, white, well-educated men. And so thinking about how do we, make these ideas appeal to demographics outside of that narrow band. And what that did was kind of, to use the language of our time, wokeify me, where I started to realize that there is a lot of oppression of marginalized identities perpetrated by the state, but also not perpetrated by the state. And libertarianism can be a little bit simplistic, and that if the current distribution of private property were left alone and the state disappeared, it would still be fundamentally unfair because the current distribution of property is a result of sexism and racism and other forms of bigotry. And so I identify now as a sex positive, feminist, libertarian / neoliberal. And so my influences when coming into libertarianism were, Ron Paul, the Mises Institute, Rothbard, Hayek, the heavy hitters of the white dude libertarian canon. And since then, I've read a little differently. Kimberly Crenshaw, Black women on Twitter, a more feminist set of influences, and got into land use reform when I moved to San Francisco, and then a few years ago got really into what I believe is the increasing war on sex, especially online. So yeah, that's kind of been my focus and my evolution.
I wanted to ask about your newsletter. I really enjoy your writing. It's very eclectic, I feel like, and wide ranging, and it's very funny, and kind of insightful in ways that you don't expect. I'm curious most of all about just hearing the rationale about both the title of your newsletter, Sex and the State, and also you so commonly describe it as a newsletter about power. And I'm kind of curious to hear you elaborate on how, sex, the state, and power, why those loom so tall in your thought, and why you made them so central to the name of your what you write all the time.
Well, thank you so much for the kind words. I think that what I noticed was that libertarianism was not super hitting with women and racial minorities in particular. And I just felt a lot more qualified to address the feminism component of libertarianism than the racial component. And so Sex and the State was, how do we have a libertarianism that has something to offer and appeals to women? How do we bridge the gap between libertarianism and feminism? And so that was the thinking behind Sex and the State. And I also think that, growing up evangelical and just being me, like I've always been very obsessed with sex as something to think about and something that's super interesting. And I I wanted to focus in on that. And I think that the power aspect is two things. One, there's a famous quote that is attributed to Oscar Wilde, but I think is apocryphal, which is everything in the world is about sex except for sex. Sex is about power. And then also just the long process of trying to figure out what is the common thread that binds the things that I really care about, because I care about immigration, criminal justice reform, privacy to an extent. I care about sex work decrim. I care about land use reform. I care about corporatism. I care like what is the thing that binds all these things together? And I think one aspect of it is justice, but the other aspect is power and how those two concepts are inextricably linked. And so I think I am not against power necessarily, but I am keenly aware of and disturbed by the unfair and unjust and inefficient way that power is currently distributed.
So why would you say you're not necessarily against power? It seems like you think at least power is very overrated and more omnipresent than it should be. Do you see it as kind of inevitable, kind of unescapable, or?
One thing that I've gone through recently is I took a class on how to be a Dom. And it is obviously, or I don't know, it wasn't really obvious to me, but it was a lot about power. Domination and submission is power exchange. And it made me realize that I had kind of an anti-power aesthetic, but that power is beautiful. Like when you think about it, power is just efficaciousness. It's the ability to get your vision made into reality. And whatever else we would want to see in the world, whether it's more fairness or more prosperity, that you can't accomplish it without power, right? Like that, by definition, you accomplishing your goal is you exercising your power. And so I think that it's really important for people who have an innate or a developed strong sense of fairness to not reject power, because that's disempowering, right? We're not going to get a fairer world if nobody's willing to step up and make their vision into reality. And so that's why I'm not against power as a concept or as a tool. But I just think that, again, like the way that power is currently distributed is not only unjust, but it doesn't even work for anything else we'd want to see in the world. If we want to see greater prosperity, the current distribution of power is not getting us there. If we want to see, just anything else we'd want to see. So I don't think power in and of itself, when you get down to the foundations of what it means, is a bad thing. But I think where we talk about power, we're often talking about coercion. We're often talking about non-cooperative forms of power, but those are not necessarily one and the same. You can have power that's cooperative, that's consensual, and that's the kind of power that I want to see people who care about justice have more of.
Right. So you're for self-empowerment, but not necessarily power over others. I guess that's where you see it as.
Well, I think again, going back to the Dom sub relationship, you do have power over another, but it's freely given and freely irrevocable. And I think that's the kind of power I want to see, that's mutually advantageous, consensually entered into, we're getting hella philosophical, but like, in order to have a consensual exchange, you need equal amounts of power coming in, or roughly equal amounts of power coming in. And so it's not a true power exchange if two people don't come into the exchange equally empowered. But that doesn't mean you can't give someone temporarily some power over you for a purpose. So that's what I want to see, is everyone empowered equally. And then if we find that it helps us or makes more sense to empower another person for a specific task, for a specific period of time, like, let's do that.
I was going to ask this question later, but I think your discussion of the class you took on being a dom ties into it, and I wanted to ask about, I guess what you think about play in human life in general, and also in particular sex, the appeal and function of play, and especially, is there a danger that we need to be alert to if play leaks out into other parts of our lives that we don't intend? Everything from acting to sexual role play to other relationships might involve these things called play. But I wonder, that seems to tie into what you're saying, and I'm curious what your take on that is.
I think that people who haven't thought a lot about BDSM and kink have a really hard time imagining a scenario in which you voluntarily give up control to another person in some way, shape, or form, could be healthy or advantageous. And it's tough because, like, I want to use the having a job as an analogy for, like, well, you give up control of your time for 8 hours a day to another person voluntarily for mutual benefit. But that's not a great analogy in a scarce capitalistic system, because that's not two people who are equally empowered coming into that exchange. But, to the extent that it is possible to have two equally empowered people coming together to play in such a way that a power exchange takes place, I think can be extremely healthy, but it can also be unhealthy. Just like any exchange can be unhealthy. Either you can not know what you're signing up for, or you can have trusted someone you shouldn't trust. But I don't think that that's a reason to castigate certain forms of play because they can be abused, because any situation can be abused. Any situation can have things happen that shouldn't happen. But I think play is super important because, I mean, one, there's a lot of evidence that people who participate in BDSM, for example, are equally, if not more, emotionally healthy than people who don't. That BDSM can be a great way to, work through trauma that you've experienced. To experience something that you experience as traumatic the first time, but to do it again in a way that's consensual and where you're in control can be really healing for people. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity for, when we look at, like, animals playing, right, what they're doing often is they're mimicking things that they would do in the wild with high stakes in a low stakes environment. And I think that when we think about play for us, things that you do when you're playing would be figuring out what your limits are, expressing your limits, enforcing your boundaries, right? And it should be done in a low stakes environment where you and the person that you're playing with, you trust each other, you're equally empowered. But the things that you're learning there, you can take into high stakes environments and assert your boundaries and know your limits and come out healthier and more whole as a result of having this practice that you get during play. And I think, just for me, like, it was a really interesting learning experience, like trying to play the role of dom and thinking through, like, what does power mean to me? I found that really, really helpful and interesting.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very insightful into the nature of play, particularly the comparison to other animals. That's true, kind of commonality we have between us, I suppose. So you talk about. I was kind of intrigued by one of your essays on your Substack. You talk about the quote empowering fantasy of being curious, following the questions, evaluating the evidence, updating your beliefs, and repeating that process. You say existence is worthwhile, kind of in virtue of its potential for change and for that ability to charge into the unknown. And a lot of that really resonates with me, and I really get where you're coming from. And at the same time, and elsewhere in some of your pieces, you seem to be wondering about what's really enduring and what doesn't change. And as you've chronicled very interestingly on your Substack, you've recently moved back to the small town in which you grew up. And it's interesting to me because that's not unknown to you. But you're writing when you write about it, it gives me the feeling that you're coming at it and you're experiencing it with fresh eyes. And I'm curious about this tendency to be curious and how it relates to the possibility of some things that might be enduring or unchanging. If there's a tension there.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I think that, I just got back onto online dating, RIP me, and I put on my Hinge profile something I want to debate or something like that, nihilism, yes or no, and why. I think that since coming out of evangelical Christianity, I wouldn't say I've struggled with nihilism, but like it's just like there. And I've really gone back and forth about, is existence good or bad? And I think where I've come to right now is that what I'll say for existence, what it has over non existence is it is more interesting. I can't say it's more fun. I can't say it's more pleasant. I can't say it's more meaningful or fulfilling because that would require some source of meaning or fulfillment, but I do find it experientially interesting. Existence is interesting to me, and I think that when I think about what I like about myself and what I like about other people, curiosity is extremely high on that list. I think when you think about the heart of existence and what makes it cool, interestingness is high up there, and to tap into that interestingness, you need curiosity. And so I think that I have become a lot more curious as I've gotten older. I think that I've become a lot less convinced that I'm right, which is step one for curiosity. If you're convinced you know something, then you can't be curious at the same time. And so when I lived here growing up, I was curious, but not particularly about this place. I didn't think it was particularly a particularly interesting place to be. I was much more curious about cities. But coming back, I'm so curious about it. I'm curious about it because I never really lived it to an extent, and I'm curious about it because when I read about red states, when I read about red states when I lived in blue cities, I didn't recognize them. Even having grown up conservative in Alabama and evangelical and like all these things, like I'm just like this is not the belief system I grew up with. These are not the instincts that I was taught. These are not the beliefs that I held, and I don't know these people. Like I don't know this place anymore. And so coming back, I'm super super curious. Having spent 10 years away, did I ever know it? And what's changed? And what's happening to red state America? And so I think I'm trying to come in. You can come into a situation and somebody says something that doesn't make sense to you. And my instinct in the past has been to kind of pretend like I'm keeping up, to not draw attention to the fact that I don't understand or I'm an outsider or I'm ignorant. And I'm trying to come into these situations saying like, I don't understand, like, and I want to. I'm more curious than I am interested in seeming like I know what I'm talking about or like I belong. And so yeah, I'm like super interested in all that and interested in, yeah, like what's changed, what hasn't changed, what's permanent. I think all that is kind of what I want to get out of life, is to keep learning, to keep understanding, to keep realizing I don't know and I don't understand, and that there's always more to know and to understand.
It's funny going from you saying there that kind of expressing a deep humility that's come about, but to ask you the following question. But in some ways, I think the people who are self-aware of the need for that humility offer the best answers, especially with a question about. I think you being someone with experience of going from a small town in a red state to you lived in DC, you lived in San Francisco, back to a small town in a red state. What do you think the left, on average, tends to misunderstand about the right?
That's a great question. I think in many ways, the right understands the left better than the left understands the right. And I think that's because a lot of left-wing ideas are put out there through mass media. So books, TV, movies, radio, music. And there isn't really a similarly ubiquitous pathway for right-wing ideas to get into left-wing culture. And I've actually seen studies that show this, that if you ask a right-winger what a left-winger believes, they can give a more accurate view than if you do the opposite. So I think there's a lot. And I think one of the things is right-wing people tend to be a lot more community focused as far as their actual geographic community and their extended family. So they're more likely to be involved in church and be involved in volunteering and donating to causes that actually impact like their geographic community, versus progressive people are more likely to favor higher taxation or give to the ACLU National and be less involved in the pressing problems of the people physically around them. And one isn't better or worse than the other. Like, we need people to do both. But I just think like a lot of progressives like would look at conservatives and be like, oh, like they don't care about people. But it's like, no, I mean, the data is pretty clear that they care at least as much. They just care differently. I think one of the best books I've ever read about the geographic and ideological divide in America is Alienated America by Tim Carney. And he talks about the difference between areas of the country that went for Trump in the primary versus went for a different Republican nominee in the primary. And what he found is that the areas that didn't go for Trump were more likely to believe that America was on a good path, on a decent path. And they were also more likely to have active civil society. And that for most of America, especially red state America, civil society looks like church and PTA and maybe a bowling league, but especially church. And the other huge aspect is immigrant communities. And that these, where you have hollowed out civil society because the people who are running civil society leave because there aren't economic opportunities for them, then you see alienation, despair, deaths of despair, and a view that America is on the wrong path and needs to go back to a situation in which we didn't have this brain drain, we didn't have this hollowing out of civil society. And I think that I had heard, well, I did know, for example, that in most of America, church attendance is highly correlated with income and education, but religious belief is not. And church attendance is not that correlated with religious belief. And so church is serving a function in American society that is, I think, really important and poorly understood by progressive America. So those are a few things that I think that progressives don't understand about conservatives that I think would be helpful.
That ties into something more broad I wanted to ask you about, which which is religion. You speak about religion on your Substack and your poor experiences with religion early in life. But now you're coming back to a place where religion is central. One of your comments in one of your essays was about how people speak maybe a little too openly about their religious beliefs for your taste in your town. And I've had a weird relationship with religion too, a rocky one over the years. And I'm curious, what do you think about it? I mean, you're gesturing at some important institutional functions that organized religion may provide. What do you think about it more generally?
I'm going to be honest with you.
Please.
I was I was really religious growing up. Into college, I really didn't start distancing myself from religion until I was in college, and but even then, like, I lost my quote unquote virginity to my husband on my wedding night after I graduated. Like, I went to church 3 times a week, like went on mission trips, proselytized to my friends. Like, I was a true believer. And the process of deconstructing evangelicism was really difficult for me. It was really unpleasant. And I have spent a lot of my life, and still to this day remain, pretty angry about the way religion was used to harm me and harm others. But it's been more than a decade since I started the process of deconstruction in earnest. There was a long delay between like me becoming less religious and me like really separating myself from religion as a source of guidance for me on moral decisions. And so, you know, I read Jesus and John Wayne last year, and it was really good. Highly recommend it. And, you know, I'll read about religion, and I'm to the point now where I can look and say, you know, hey, church is a useful source of civil society and mutual aid. And, you know, I can look at the empirical situation and say church is doing a lot of good for a lot of people. But as far as digging deep into what's good and bad about organized religion in the United States, I feel still pretty blocked by my anger and resentment and fear. Honestly, I'm afraid of religion because I don't half-ass things well. And I remember how compelling religion was for me. It was wonderful to feel like I had a purpose. That wasn't a purpose I chose. It was the purpose. I had the truth. I had a meaning and a purpose and a creator who cared about me and a reason to live and a guidebook on how to behave. Like, all that is awesome. It's extremely pleasant, and I miss it every day. And so, yeah, I feel like I could give you a better answer if I didn't have a lot of PTSD around the topic. But I was tweeting recently about how it's fascinating to think about evangelical Christian approaches to sin and crime, for example. Like, I think it's super interesting to think about sin nature and how the evangelical approach to crime doesn't leave much, if any, room for rehabilitation. It seems to categorize people into good people and bad people. But that's kind of at odds with the idea of the sin nature, which is that everyone is inherently bad, but we are capable of acting good if the incentives and grace of God are right, come into play. So it seems to be, the idea seems to be we're all bad, but if the punishments are harsh enough, we'll act good. But like, that doesn't really comport with reality because incentives matter a lot more than punishments. They're a lot more effective. And incentives would indicate, and all of social science would indicate, that humans tend to be pretty pro-social by default, and that when we act bad, it's usually the circumstances are pretty bad. So yeah, I don't know. I think about that kind of thing, but it's hard for me to get too far into it because I don't want to get sucked back in, and because it makes me really, really angry. And it does make me angry because I look at people like, Matt Gaetz and his bullshit about I'm a family Christian guy, and I don't support abortion and all this stuff because I'm a Christian, and then he's hiring 17-year-old hookers, and it's the same shit I grew up with, but like worse somehow, seemingly, in some ways. Like, it's just weird to me that as the country has become less religious, politicians seem to be more. I don't remember such overt appeals to evangelical Christianity from my politicians when I was growing up, and maybe it was just because it was the air I breathed and the water I drank, and so I just didn't notice it. But it's odd how much evangelicals keep America in a stranglehold, despite the fact that the country is secularizing.
Well, what do you think the right misunderstands most about the left?
Honestly, what comes to mind is just what led me on my path, which is that there's no, it's not that there's no way to know, but you're not going to know what it's like to be marginalized if you're not marginalized in that way. Everyone's marginalized in some way, but you're not going to know what it's like to be marginalized in a way you're not marginalized. And that's why I got big into the check your privilege thing, because it was so revelatory for me. It was like, oh shit, I don't know anything about racism really, because I don't experience it directly. And I have to go out of my way to educate myself because nobody's going out of their way to educate me. That's not true, but it hadn't gotten to me. That there's this whole world going on that you're just not going to be aware of unless you put effort into becoming aware of it. And so it's going to sound insane when you hear people talking about these things because you don't have any context with it, because you haven't experienced it. Like, you have to educate yourself about it to become aware of it for it to start making any sense to you. And I think it's really frustrating that people who oppose the actual goals of like feminism or anti-racism will take the craziest, most out of context, most extreme statements by anti-racists and feminists, just for example, and show their followers like, oh, this is what feminism is. This is what anti-racism is. This is what this ideology is about. And it's like, no, it's not. You've just cherry picked some stuff is going to rile up your base, because you don't just oppose this crazy fringe element of this ideology. Like, you oppose feminism, like you oppose gender equality. You are in support of sexism. Like, you like racism, but because that's not going to sell, then you posit it like, oh, gender equality is fine, but feminism is crazy. So a lot of conservatives don't have any interaction with progressive ideas, like from progressives. They only have interaction with progressive ideas mediated through grifter conservatives who have an agenda against the foundations of those ideas. And I see that a lot, where it's like, feminism is X and feminism is Y. And it's like, well, have you ever listened to a feminist? Or are you just getting this from your right-wing grifter YouTubers? And so that's really frustrating. And I think there's a really deep conspiratorial strain within conservatism, where a lot of conservatives have a lot of ideas about progressives that are kind of based in a conspiratorial, paranoid fantasy of like, we're all funded by Soros for the purpose of installing a shadowy cabal of world government that wants to kill all white men. It just there. It's and it's always been there. You've always had the John Birchers, you've always had the birthers, you've always had a contingent of kind of a paranoid right wing. But I'm seeing these ideas pervade the mainstream of conservative thought. I mean, you see it in the okay groomer pedophile discourse, right? Where it's like, no, it's not just that gay people want to be able to live and be okay. They want to convert the children, right? I think that's something that conservatives don't understand about progressives is that like most of us really just want to like fucking vibe, man. Like we're not trying to convert anyone. We are not trying to install a world government. We are not trying to get that Soros money. So, if you want to fund me, hit me up. We just want what you want, which is to be okay.
Well, I regret to inform you, Cathy, that this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio is sponsored by George Soros. And he's a so we'll just edit your part out because it doesn't sound great with. When I met you, you had a tattoo that said "I own me" on your arm. What led to you getting that, and does that idea still play a role in your worldview?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I have a tattoo still that says "I own me," and the story is a little embarrassing, but you know what? That's fine. I got really into anarcho-capitalism in my first job after college. I'm huge into systematizing. I think it's part of my neurodiversity. And man, it was just such a beautiful system. It's like, yeah, every exchange should be voluntary. And it all arises out of the idea that you own yourself. And yeah, that was just a really compelling message to me. And so the idea that I own myself and I have the rights to my body and my property and anything that I mutually enter into was just a really powerful kind of basis for a system I found really beautiful. And not obviously, but in the interim, I have gotten a little more, my views on property rights have become a little more nuanced. I don't think private property is an unmitigated good. I think it's useful. I still support property rights because I want to see us move to post-scarcity, and I don't think you get there without them, but it doesn't make them an end in and of themselves. And but I still think there is something really beautiful about the idea that we own ourselves. Another thing that's changed between then and now is that I was really enamored of individualism for most of my life. And I still think some aspects of individualism are great, but I think in the intervening years, I've become much more aware of how much meaning and purpose and fulfillment we get from other people and from community. And I think if American culture is lacking anything, I don't think it's insufficient individualism. I think it's insufficient interdependence. I think we have a loneliness epidemic. I think we're alienated from our communities. And so that's changed. I think, not that I wouldn't have gotten it, but my views on self-ownership and individualism have definitely become more complicated over the years. This is what you would want, but I still believe I own myself, and I still think property rights are useful. And I think now with women's bodily autonomy under attack, like I'm glad to have been standing up for the right of women to own themselves for a long time. And I think it goes into the sex work thing as well. Like, if I'm not allowed to rent out access to my body, then I don't really own it. And I think it is a really important thing to give people the autonomy and respect of being allowed to own themselves and their bodies.
I agree, and I love that tattoo. I think it is a beautiful statement, and I do think you own yourself. Um, you're you're one of the most open people I think I know on the internet. So why are you so open, and what is it like to be such an open book on the internet?
My mom told me she studied English when I was little, and she said, great literature makes us feel less alone. And I remember in the early days of the internet reading people's diaries. That's one of the first things I did was I found Diaryland and started reading people's diaries and live journal. And it made me feel like less of a weirdo. It made me feel less alone. It made me feel like it was okay to be me, to read these other people being them. Even if we weren't weird in the same way, that they were equally weird in a different way was really comforting to me. And I want to do that for other people. And it's really low cost to me. Like, I don't get embarrassed by things that embarrass other people for some reason. I get hella embarrassed about things that don't embarrass other people. It's not, I deal with shame a lot, which is why I'm so obsessed with shame as a concept. But yeah, I really want to know and be known. And you can't get there if you're not vulnerable. And so if I can embarrass myself online and one person is like, I feel a little bit better about existence, the cost benefit is there for me to be vulnerable online. And I think selfishly, writing is how I figure myself out. It's how I decide what I'm feeling. It's how I do sense making. And I'm a fucking narcissist, and I want, if I'm going to be bothered to write something, like, I want people to read it. I want people to engage with me. I want people to tell me I'm wrong. I want to have the conversation. And so if I need to be a little bit embarrassed to have the conversation, it's worth it to me.
You embarrassed online? I don't. I want to ask you one more question before we wrap up. You talk about the hating porn to making porn pipeline that you have been a victim. No, not a victim of a survivor.
Survivor.
Wasn't sure the word. What other pipelines might be waiting? Do you ever have a sense that what you're going to change your views about in the future? Because we started this talking about things that never change, but it feels like your ideas change a lot, and my ideas and everyone's ideas. So, or would you?
I mean, I hope I
Yeah,
have no
you
idea.
can't know until.
I hope I have, yeah, I hope it's shocking, because I know if I had asked 15-year-old me, like, hey, do you think you're going to be making porn? That would have been shocking to her. And it's been the most interesting ride of my life to do things that would have shocked my younger self. And so I hope I have no idea what I'm going to be like in 10, 20, 30 years. I will say, I think one path that I'm definitely on is creating a new relationship with conservatism, where I think I just avoided it. Well, I was angry, and to the extent that I would engage, it was in a very hateful, angry, this is not me, this is not what I believe kind of way. And I would like to engage with conservatism more productively going forward, because I have the advantage of having grown up in that environment. And so I think I have the tools in some way to engage more productively than someone who doesn't have that background. But the trauma gets in the way. And so working through that, I think, is a goal of mine for sure. And whether that ends up with me becoming more conservative in some ways, I hope not, but maybe that's the way. But yeah, the big thing is, I hope I continue to not just surprise, but to continue shocking myself.
Okay, good answer. Um, Before we go, where can our listeners find you if they want to read your stuff or reach out to you?
If you want to read my embarrassing diary, check out Sex in the State. You can Google Sex in the State or Google Cathy Reisenwitz, or just type in cathyreisenwitz.substack.com. That is CathyReisenwitz.substack.com. See pictures of me naked on the internet at onlyfans.com/Cathy Reisenwitz. I am always on Twitter at Cathy Reisenwitz. And I also have an Instagram if you're interested, which is Cathy Reisenwitz 0F.
All right. Well, thanks so much for talking to me for this time, Cathy. It's been really enjoyable to get to pick your brain, and it's been fun. And good luck in your...
One of the most interesting conversations I've had in a while.
I'm very glad.
Thank you.
Me as well. And good luck in your sure to be shocking developments as you go forward in life. And thanks to our listeners so much for your support. We'll see you next month in the next episode of Mutual Exchange Radio.